In this demonstration, we'll take a look at a couple different ways to create SQL databases and review the initial configuration. For this demo, I'm going to get started with Azure SQL Database. And the reason I'll do that will be clear, I hope, because it's going to take a few minutes for it to run in the background, and I can cut over and show you how to create databases in SQL Server Management Studio for on-premise databases or virtual machines. So let's start here at the Azure portal. I've logged in with my Microsoft account. I'm looking at my dashboard, and I'm going to create a new Azure SQL database. And there will be a number of decisions you'll need to make, and this course isn't designed to go through all of those decisions and all of those configuration options, but you'll get a flavor of what's involved. I do want to commend you to some of our other MVA programs on Azure SQL Database. So I'm going to go ahead and specify that I want to create a new database. And I'll go to Data and Storage, and I'll choose SQL Database. And the blade will open where I can start the configuration. I'll be asked for a name. It'll populate with my subscription information, and there'll be other information I'll change as I go. So one of the most important things, of course, is going to be the name of the database, because that's going to be used by every application and perhaps every ad hoc report user that's going to be connecting to this. So I'll give this hopefully a clear name. We'll call this MVA Fundamentals Demo, and I'll use my Azure subscription. Azure offers a couple of different ways of deploying SQL databases. I'm going to take advantage of the fact that I've made these before, and I'll use an existing resource group to make it easier for myself to clean up. I've got a resource group called MVA Demos, but as you get deeper into Azure, you'll find that there are a number of resources that get created just in the process of creating a virtual machine or a SQL database or other items, and resource groups are a nice way to keep them together and make it convenient to manage. All right, well, I want to create a new database, and Azure gives me the opportunity here to either start from scratch with a blank database, to use one of the samples available, or even to restore from a backup of another SQL database in Azure. I'll start with a blank database. I'm then asked what logical server I want to put this on, and I have the ability either to choose from one of my existing logical servers, or I can create a new server and walk through that whole process. For the purposes of this demo, I'm going to keep this fairly straightforward. I'll use one of my existing servers, but I do want to point out that if you're going to create your own new server, you will need to configure firewall rules to enable you to connect to it, and you will need to provision an administrator account. All right, so let's go ahead and walk down through my choices. Now, what pricing tier do I want? This is a much longer discussion than we're going to have right now, but in a nutshell, a pricing tier is a way of bundling a performance level in something we call database transaction units. And it's a combination of compute resources and storage resources and some other features that enable us to control how responsive the SQL database is going to be. For the purposes of this demo, I'll choose a P1. We'll see that's going to give me up to 500 gigabytes of storage. It's going to automatically include geo-replication and point-in-time restore. There are a whole long list of these pricing tiers. And again, I encourage you to hit the Azure documentation to learn the differences between them if you're going to be using Azure SQL databases. I'm also going to be asked about a collation, and a collation in brief is a combination of character set and sort order, which will drive how things like your applications will communicate with the database. I'll leave my default here, my SQL Latin 1 General, code page 1, case-insensitive ascending sort. That's my default here in the US. When I'm done with this, I'll want it to be pinned to the dashboard of the portal just for convenience. That doesn't really have anything to do with creating a database, but it will make it easier for me to find it and show it to you. All right, well, I'll go ahead and click Create. And it says, hey, if you made any changes in some of the other blades, we're going to get rid of them. That's fine with me. And I'll see a message here that says that I am submitting the deployment to the server. That's going to take a few minutes, so I'm going to let that cook in the background. And in the meantime, I'm going to switch over to SQL Server Management Studio, which I have connected to a local instance here on my laptop. So let's put the portal away for now, and let's bring up SQL Server Management Studio. And here in SQL Server Management Studio for SQL Server 2016, I've got a connection to my local laptop here, which is called Shoal. I am logged in as myself, and I've given myself, during installation, I've given myself administrative privileges. But one of the things you want to make sure you do when you install your own SQL Server is make sure that you also create an account that has permissions to access it, and for that first account anyway, permission to do things like create databases and so forth. So in this view of SQL Server Management Studio, I have a list of what databases are available to me on this particular instance. And as we mentioned in the presentation, an instance is essentially a running copy of SQL Server. You can have multiple instances on one machine based on what the resource load is going to be and how much performance your machine has. And on this instance, I have several user databases. There's an old sample here called AdventureWorks 2016 CTP3, and then a couple of samples that I pulled down from Microsoft.com that are the new samples for SQL Server 2016. In this interface, I have access to the databases and the objects within them, everything from tables and views and the service broker settings and security settings. But I've also got access to system-level features such as system-level security. Who's allowed to log into this instance? What are they allowed to do when they get here? And so on. For the purposes of this demonstration, I simply want to set up a database and make it ready for future demos. So I'm going to start by generating a script from one of the existing databases and reviewing its results. So using a feature of SQL Server Management Studio, I'm right-clicking on Wide World Importers. I'm going to specify that I want to script it out as a create operation to a new editor window. Now I could script this right to a file on disk, I could script this to my clipboard and so on. But let's use a new query editor window. And we'll see a lot of T-SQL has been generated here. And we're not going to walk through all of this, but I do want to show you some of the critical things that are part of creating a new database in SQL Server. So I'll walk through and I'll highlight certain key things as we go. And if you're interested in more of the other options, I encourage you to take a look at MSDN and Books Online, and I encourage you to take a look at some of our other courses. So the first thing this script had to do was to switch to the master database, which is a system-level configuration database. And then we'll see comments, which are these bits in, well, they were in green before I highlighted them in yellow, but we'll see those are T-SQL comments. And that's simply documenting what's being scripted at any given point when the script was generated. And now we get to the good part, the create database statement. So that's our key, and there are many, many options, but we're going to focus on the core ones here. So we'll say create database, and we'll give that database a name, such as create database wide world importers. At a minimum, that's all you need to do. SQL Server comes with a number of default settings, and we'll take a look at some of those when we create our own database in a few minutes. But at a minimum, that will then put the data files and transaction log files for this database in the default locations for that particular server instance. It will have a default size and other default settings. But let's review some of those settings that are available to us. So create database wide world importers. We'll skip containment for now, but that's a security feature for later. Then there's a setting here for what file group it's going to be using. Then this is going to be one called user data. We'll talk more about that in a more advanced course. But the key thing here is that we're specifying that this database has a file that we're going to give a nickname or logical name of WWI primary, and the actual file is going to be located in my file system. Now that is a default location, and we never recommend that you place your user databases in that default location. And once you're in an environment with a SAN, for example, you'll be placing your data files on that SAN. But I've got just a developer laptop here, and I'm putting things in local locations that aren't going to live forever, so I'm not terribly worried about the locations. However, just for comparison's sake, let me just show you what I've done here for my own databases. On my C drive, I've created a folder called SQL Data. I'm trying to zoom in so we can see it. And I've just, on my SQL Data directory here, I've created some folders here for data, transaction logs, and backup. And then I've marked those as the default for this instance so that as I add new databases, they will by default be placed in those locations. And we'll take a look at how that goes. All right, let's get back to SQL Server Management Studio. So one of the things we need to do to create a database is we need to specify where the files are going to go. And at a minimum, you'll start with two types of files in a SQL Server. You'll start with a data file. And so if we scroll all the way to the end of this long path, we'll see that we're creating a data file called wideworldimporters.mdf. MDF is just a convention for the extension. There's no requirement that you call it that way, but that's what most of us tend to do so that other DBAs looking at our work can understand what they're seeing. And as I mentioned, there are defaults for lots and lots of things, but you can also specify things like what the starting size is going to be, whether it can grow, and if so, how much, and what that growth increment should be. And these we get into in more advanced developer and administrative courses, but just understand that there are a number of things you can do to control that, and we'll take a look at them a little later. So we'll create a initial data file. There's some other files here that this particular sample is using I'm going to ignore for now. And we'll also specify then that we need a transaction log. And so we're creating something here called WWI log. And again, it's got a long path and file name here to create a file called worldwideimporters.ldf. And that transaction log file is so important to SQL Server because of the way the SQL Server engine writes changes from memory down to disk and records a history of those actions in the transaction log. So to create a database at a minimum, we're going to want a data file, and we're going to want a log, and we're either going to specify our own settings, or we're going to allow the defaults to kick in. And for the purposes of our discussion here, the rest of all of these settings are simply ways of recording in the script what the DBA who created this database did in setting it up. So let's take another approach to this. If I go back to my Object Explorer, and I right-click on the Databases folder under my instance, I can click on New Database, and I'll get a dialog box with some choices very similar to what we've just been looking at, such as what do we want to call our new database? Where do you want the data file to go and what should it be called? Where do you want the log file and what should it be called? And a long list of options, many of which were recorded in that script that we just looked at. So let's take a straightforward starting approach to creating a new database, and I will call this MVA demo local DB, as opposed to the cloud database that I've got running in the background right now. And I will review then the logical names for the files that will be created, so MVA demo local DB and MVA demo local DB log. We'll see that this is going to be for data rows, and this is going to be for transaction log items. We'll see it's creating a default primary file group. We can specify our initial size in megabytes. So let's just go 500, for example, and an initial size for the log. I'm not going to do a lot with this database, so I don't need a lot of storage to record changes. We can, if we want, get into auto growth settings. We'll talk more about those in other courses. And then finally, we can choose where we want these files to go. And I don't want them to go under C program files, so I'll go ahead and select that folder that I showed you earlier, which was on my C drive, SQL data, and this is going to go in the data folder. And my log is going to go in my logs folder. And because I'm working on a laptop that only has a single drive, I really can't show you best practices such as putting the data file or files and the transaction log on separate disks or separate units in a SAN. This is as close as I can get, but it'll help sort of plant that seed that we want our databases and our logs in separate locations for performance and to some extent for fault tolerance. All right, and then finally I'll be asked to give these names, and if I leave it blank, it'll just name it after the logical name, so I'm simply going to leave it blank. And at this point, again, I could review other options and add file groups for adding additional files. I won't do that for this particular database. If I'm ready to go, I can just click OK, but before I do that, let me go ahead and tell this to take what I've done here and script this out to a new window, so that when I click OK, while we're waiting for the engine to build that database, we can go and review what instructions it was just given. So there's my T-SQL, create this database, and that primary file group is going to be that file called MVA localdb.mdf on my C SQL data folder. Same idea with the log, the initial settings I'd created, and then all of those other options that we don't have the opportunity to get into right now. But we've now got a database. I'm going to close this without saving because I know I had asked the Management Studio to create that for me. And I would expect now to see my database here in the list of database. And sure enough, there is MVA demo local DB. And we'll see in SSMS here, Management Studio, the containers here where we'll then be able to get in and do things like add tables and so forth, which we'll get into later in this course. So in this part of the demo, we've gone ahead and created a brand new database. We can connect to that database and start writing queries with it, adding objects, And we'll get into those things as the course goes on.